Hey y'all, welcome back. Today we're going to check out the most brutal sacking in history. You're fired!
In August 1962, Pete Best was fired from the Beatles and replaced by Ringo Starr, just months before they went from playing clubs in Liverpool to global success. Many would argue the reason for his dismissal wasn't even fair, but what's even more heartbreaking are the years that followed, all whilst the Beatles were the biggest stars on the planet.
Y'all, can you imagine being Pete Best? August of 1962. Oh, there's a Wikipedia about August of 62. Okay, what was going on? On August 3rd, 1962, JFK decided to break ties with singer Frank Sinatra after his brother, U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, reported to him about Sinatra's connections with organized crime. Sinatra was reportedly so enraged by the president's decision to no longer visit the singer's Palm Springs home that he took a sledgehammer and personally destroyed a landing pad built to accommodate visits by the presidential helicopter, Marine One. So Frank Sinatra sort of got fired too the next day, August 4th. August 4th, 62, Marilyn Monroe took a fatal overdose of dang. August 5th, Nelson Mandela was arrested and imprisoned for 27... Y'all, August of 1962 was a pivotal month. The Soviet Union conducted the second largest nuclear test in history. Jamaica received its independence from the United Kingdom on August 6th. Michelle Yeoh was born, Oscar-winning actor. Wow, lots of stuff going on. Lots of stuff.
Many would argue the reason for his dismissal wasn't even fair, but what's even more heartbreaking are the years that followed, all whilst the Beatles were the biggest stars on the planet. The Beatles went through a few personnel changes in their early years before finally arriving at the Fab Four we all know. There was Stuart Sutcliffe, who played bass before leaving to pursue an art career, and Tommy Moore and Norman Chapman, who both very briefly played drums in the band. But by the summer of
I didn't know about them. Hang on, what?
And Tommy Moore.
What? He played with the Beatles from May to June 1960. While he was on tour with the Beatles, he was injured and lost his front teeth when the band's van, driven by Gentle, had a minor accident. John Lennon and the Scottish organizer of the tour took him out of hospital and insisted that he perform with the rest of the group. Dang, John. Oh, Moore had already decided that he had had enough of Lennon. When he did not appear for a gig one night, the rest of the band went round to his flat and were told by his wife Veronica Hughes that he had gone back to a steady job at the Bottle Works. When they tried to persuade her otherwise, she apparently shouted, "You can all piss off." Bad call, Veronica. He undertook one further performance with the group before they left for Germany with Pete Best as their drummer in August 1960. Norman Chapman. After Tommy Moore left in June 1960, Chapman joined the Silver Beatles. However, Chapman only played 3 shows with the group in June 1960 before he left due to being called up for national service. He was replaced in the group by Pete Best. After finishing his time in the national service, he played with several local bands, including Ernie Mac and the Saturated Seven.
But by the summer of 1962, the Beatles had a well-established lineup of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Pete Best. By now, the Beatles were a successful group, particularly in Liverpool, where they were still often playing at the Cavern Club, and they'd also just concluded their Hamburg residency, which saw them honing their craft night after night to excited German audiences. Their success
I think they played for like 6 to 8 hours a night when they were in Germany. Also, something about Pete Best's drumming was that he had a light touch. He's kind of like, he didn't hit the drums very hard, very light. And he often did a beat called 4 on the Floor, which is where the kick drum is being played on every quarter note, which is kind of like a techno beat now. And I've noticed, I'm a drummer myself and a guitar player, I've noticed once you play a 4 on the floor beat, it almost makes any other beat sound not as good because it's so simple and you have the kick drum on every beat. There's just something about it. It's really infectious. Makes you want to dance. And I noticed that Ringo never did that, not that I know of. And I bet he never did that because Pete Best did it all the time. You know? I bet he was like purposefully staying away from doing that.
Their success continued that summer when their manager Brian Epstein was able to sign them to EMI Records. After recording a few demos and audition tapes earlier in the year, they now had a full recording contract where George Martin would produce their music.
Nice.
Pete Best had played on these early demos and audition tapes, but when George Martin started to produce their music, discussions were taking place over who should play drums.
And I said to Brian Epstein, when we do the next session, I mean, I don't want to interfere with the Beatles and what you're doing with them, that's fine, but I'm going to provide the drummer.
It was quite common for session drummers to be brought in to play on recordings, and George Martin felt that Pete Best's drumming wasn't good enough to warrant not being replaced.
Played too soft.
And there was some truth to what he was saying. He wasn't the only one that felt Pete's drumming wasn't up to scratch.
We just kind of fell in love with Ringo's drumming.
Right.
Ringo was in another band, and we used to go see this other band. We said, God, that drummer's good.
Right.
And one night, Pete couldn't do it, and Ringo sat in for him, and we all just went, it was like, oh my God, what is
What do we do
happening?
now?
There was something funny going on.
Yeah.
Behind us was this powerhouse who was like taking care of the job, and we went, oh dear.
Hell yeah. This is a wild scenario. So George Martin was like, Pete Best sucks. And the Beatles were like, we know he sucks. So George Martin's like, I'm going to hire a different drummer. Brian Epstein, the Beatles were like, we're going to hire another drummer. So George Martin brought in another drummer. The Beatles brought in another drummer. Everybody wanted Pete out. Poor Pete. Poor Pete. Poor Pete.
The decision was made that Pete Best would be asked to leave the group. Unsure of how to tell him, they asked Brian Epstein to fire him.
You know, it just happened completely out the blue. Yeah. There was no, forewarning, it's all about it. It just was called into Brian's office. After about 3 or 4 minutes, he turned around and said, Pete, I've got bad news for you. He said, in a nutshell, the boys want you out.
He kind of looks like Ringo here to me, doesn't he?
And they want Ringo Starr in. Mm-hmm.
What
Oh, he
makes this
told him.
even more difficult?
He even told him Ringo was going to replace him. Damn. If Pete didn't avoid that one show, he'd still have a job.
Minutes he turned around and said, Pete, I've got bad news for you. He said, in a nutshell, the boys want you out, and they want Ringo Starr in. Mm-hmm.
What makes this even more difficult is that in many ways, Pete Best was an asset to the Beatles. He was popular with their fans, put on a good show, and was a reliable drummer and band member that helped to bring in an audience to their live shows. But so it was, the decision was made that Ringo would be the new drummer.
I've also heard John say that Paul didn't like Pete because Paul thought Pete was more handsome than Paul. Something like that.
It was a Wednesday and Brian called. Would you join the band? And I said, what do you mean? He said, no, really join the band. And I said, sure, yeah, when? And he said, now.
Ringo was soon accepted as one of the Beatles,
Awesome.
receiving plenty of admiration from fans, whilst having a style and personality that wasn't incompatible with any of the other members. One of the concerns about Pete Best was that he was too good-looking and charming, and took the spotlight away from the group equally, having too much attention himself. So when Ringo first joined, many fans were disappointed that Pete Best had been fired.
We played the Cavern. There was a lot of fighting and shouting. Half of them hated me, half of them loved me.
Wow.
There was a few people there who were shouting, Ringo never, Pete Best forever. And after about half an hour, I said, oh, bugger off, something.
With Ringo, the attention was much more evenly split, and the chemistry between the four of them worked a lot better. The Beatles continued to go from strength to strength, and after releasing their debut album, Please Please Me, in 1963, they soon became global stars.
Yo, let's just watch Ringo dancing again. He's a good dancer. Go, Ringo. Yeah.
And would soon become the most successful band the world had ever seen. But for Pete Best, who was fired just before all this success, life wasn't so great.
Damn.
Basically, they had a record in the English charts within a month or so of me being kicked out. And after that, it became history. Everyone knows about it.
Now, what does that do to a person? What is there resentment there? Is it?
This video is sponsored by Skillshare. We talk a lot on this channel about the creative process of musicians, and so it's so great to be partnered with Skillshare because
Y'all go to Skillshare and buy stuff.
in the time immediately following his dismissal, things became difficult for Pete Best. He fell into a depression, not leaving his home to speak to anybody for
cannot
weeks,
imagine. I
knowing
cannot
that there would
imagine.
be inevitable questions from everyone about why he got sacked.
Oh my God.
Pete, of course, at the time, didn't even know why himself. As part of his original contract with the Beatles, Brian Epstein was obligated to find him work, and offered him the position of drummer in the Mersey Beats, but Pete turned it down. He threatened legal action, claiming he was wrongfully dismissed, but Epstein argued that he was fired because he wasn't a good enough drummer, and he fulfilled his obligation of trying to find him other work. His next musical endeavour would be joining Lee Curtis and the All-Stars later that year. Despite soon becoming one of Liverpool's top bands, they were still so far behind the Beatles in terms of success.
Lee Curtis and the All-Stars. Let's see. Lee Curtis and the All-Stars. Did they make any recordings? Oh my God, look at all these members. Lee Curtis, Frank Bowen, Tony Waddington. Not heard of any of them. Let's see if they're on iTunes. Bet they're not. Oh, here's a video. Okay.
Jimmy Cliff there. We're moving in with some big sounds right now as we come into a group that's been around Germany for some time. Lee Curtis and the
that's not Pete.
All-Stars. When you're running the ramble playing the clubs every night, you ought to be home with the girl who loves you. You know that girl will treat you right. I see.
Oh. That was falling apart.
I'm alone with the blues and I'm feeling bad.
Sounds like Elvis. Elvis ripoff. I don't blame him. If you're going to rip off somebody, Elvis is a good person to do that.
Despite soon becoming one of Liverpool's top bands, they were still so far behind the Beatles in terms of success. There was one night in particular when both bands were playing the same show, but there was little acknowledgement made of Pete's former job.
And it meant that as we were coming off stage, the Beatles were going on stage. But nothing was ever mentioned.
Pete later moved to the US where he formed the Pete Best Four, which later became the Pete Best Combo. They toured North America and made some recordings for smaller labels, but they had no success.
The Pete Best... I'm sorry, what? The Pete Best Combo. Let's check them out. Pete Best Combo. They have any music? Any videos? Songs? I'm gonna knock on your door. Okay. It's not that bad. But it's not great.
They would eventually end up releasing an album called Best of the Beatles, of course a disappointing play on words that features no actual music by the Beatles, and you think us YouTubers are guilty of clickbait. The Beatles, meanwhile, were experiencing huge global success, and starting to experiment with their own music in one of their most creative periods. Sadly though, Pete Best fell back into depression, and struggling with mental illness, at one point attempted to end his own life. From this point on, he had no further contact with the remaining Beatles. But weirdly, his mother did keep in touch. When John Lennon was looking for some medals to appear on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, he asked Pete's mother if they could borrow his army medals. Eventually, deciding to call it quits on music, he left the industry and took up work first in a bread factory and later in the civil service.
That's kind of cold. John called Pete Best's mom to see if they can use his medals. Wow. I wonder if they did. I wonder if she said yes. Wait, so on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, they're wearing Pete Best's medals? Is that right? Oh, his grandfather's. John Lennon wore Pete Best's grandfather's medals on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. Wow. What a move. Paul and George adorned their costumes with their MBEs. Lennon did not want to do this. Instead, he reached out to Best's family several years after unceremoniously firing him from the group. Here's how he got hold of his grandfather's medals. Oh, every time John came to the Casbah Club, he would ask to see the medals. That's strange. He just loved the look and feel of them and never tired of the stories behind them. Mom lived in India for a while, which was when my granddad was awarded the medals. Mona was happy to let Lennon borrow them. She was delighted to see John wear them on what turned out to be one of the greatest albums ever, Best said. John knew how important they were, so they were returned swiftly with a polite thank you note. Attaboy, John. I've never heard that fun fact before, and it's really bizarre.
Industry and took up work first in a bread factory and later in the civil service. As the years went by, the remaining three Beatles would offer some different opinions on why Pete Best was really fired, expressing different levels of regret. John, for example, was very harsh in his criticism of Pete, claiming that he was only in the Beatles because they needed a drummer.
By then we were pretty sick of Pete Best too, because he was a lousy drummer. He never improved, you know. And there was always this myth being built up over the years that he was great and Paul was jealous of him because he was pretty and all that crap, you know. And the reason he got in the group in the first place was because the only way we could get to Hamburg, we had to have a drummer.
Paul, despite agreeing that Ringo was the drummer they really wanted, was a bit kinder towards Pete.
Just a little bit of dissatisfaction started to creep in. We really started to think we needed the great drummer in Liverpool. And the great drummer in our eyes was this guy called Ringo Starr.
And George was the kindest of the other three, stating that whilst Ringo was the drummer they wanted, things could have been handled better with Pete.
Historically, it may look like we did something nasty to Pete, and it may have been that we could have done it better. But the thing was, as history also shows, Ringo was the member of the band. It's just that he didn't enter the film until that particular scene, you know?
As for Pete, well, he makes no apology of the pain it caused him at the time.
They caused me a lot of hardship, grief, you know, financial embarrassment. But I persevered with my own lifestyle, and, you know, I was strong enough in character to sort of turn around and say, okay, no matter what happened in the past, let's forget about it.
Good for you, Pete.
To be fair to the Beatles, at the time of Pete's sacking, they wouldn't have known of this immense success that was coming their way.
That's true.
They hadn't even recorded their first album, and just wanted to be the best band they possibly could. Nor were they experienced enough as professionals to know how to properly handle the sacking. John was the oldest at the time, at 21. There is, however, a silver lining for Pete. Starting in 1995, an anthology of the Beatles' work was created, consisting of a book, documentary, and 3 double albums, including many of the recordings, including Pete Best. Not only did this help to cement Pete's place in the history of the Beatles, it also brought him a handsome sum of money. He claims just under £1 million, other sources claim it was much higher.
It was great. After God knows how many years, 62 to 1990, I got some royalties from work I'd done with the Beatles.
And beyond this, Pete Best has continued his role in keeping the Beatles' legacy alive, representing his important role in those early years. To his credit, Pete Best appears to have forgiven the Beatles for what happened, and now has a healthy attitude towards life.
So there comes a time, fortunately with me, it happened fairly quickly, whereby you turn around and say, it's not about yesterday, it's about today and tomorrow. And once I got that into my head, straight road ahead.
Yeah, that's gotta be hard to do,
Beatles, and it's the euphoria. That is, I mean, that's the legacy they've left, you know, and whether anyone will ever top that legacy, God only knows. But it's a hell of a legacy, you know, and it's wonderful for me to have been a small part of that.
Oh,
thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, please take a moment to subscribe.
Yeah. Y'all, David Hartley, be sure to go to his channel and like and subscribe. He does these great documentaries. Poor Pete, y'all. I mean, I cannot imagine. Is he still with us? He's still with us. He's 82 years old. It's not too late to rejoin the band. You know, if Ringo's gone, Paul wants to do more Beatles songs. You could call Pete. So this is before they went to Hamburg. Having no permanent drummer, Paul McCartney looked for someone to fill the Hamburg position. Best had been seen playing in the Casbah with his own group, the Blackjacks, and it was observed that he played the bass drum on all 4 beats in the bar, which pushed the rhythm. In Liverpool, his female fans knew him as being mean, moody, and magnificent, which convinced McCartney he would be suitable for the group. After the Blackjacks broke up, McCartney persuaded Best to go to Hamburg with the band by saying they would each earn £15 per week, equivalent to £400 in 2024. As Best had passed his school exams, he had the chance to attend teacher training college, but he decided that playing in Hamburg would be a better career move. Best had an audition in the Jacaranda Club, which Williams owned, and traveled to Hamburg the next day. Okay. So Pete Best joined the band right before they went to Hamburg. Williams later said that the audition with Best was unnecessary as the group had not found any other drummer willing to travel to Hamburg, but did not tell Best in case he asked for more money. Wow. It could still happen, y'all. He could still get back in the band. They could reunite. What if Paul and Ringo had a falling out? It could still happen. Stranger things have happened, I think. Wow, this is crazy. Y'all, if you made it this far in the video, be sure to like and subscribe. Help me out. It's a good thing. I'd like to say thanks to my patrons. I'd like to say thanks to Buy Me a Coffee people for buying me coffees. Thanks for watching this with me, and I'll see you next time. Later.